Welcome, everybody, to this session of Senior Moments, Cybersecurity 101. My name is John Blyberg, and I'm the Assistant Director for Innovation and User Experience here at the library, which means that all of the technology falls under my purview. And I've been here for about 10 years now. Prior to that, I was out at Ann Arbor District Library, their public library out in Ann Arbor, where I was the head of technology there. And then prior to that, I worked for the car company Lotus out in Michigan as well, where I was the technology manager. And so I started probably in sort of late 90s working in technology. And I've seen a few things change over the years, from the Y2K bug all the way through where we are now, which probably brings you all here, which is that we're sort of entering into this kind of scary and weird and very concerning landscape, this digital landscape that concerns all of us with regards to our online privacy, our security, and even our identity. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to scare you, and then I'm going to tell you what you can do, some basic things that you can do to protect yourselves. And with the caveat that all of us are vulnerable. At some point, we're going to be the victim of some kind of hack or scam or something like that. In fact, all of you in this room probably already are, with recent data thefts and so on and so forth. So, if you kind of go into this just already knowing that you've been a victim and that your information is out there, your social security number is out there, then knowing how to kind of proceed from here is a good thing. And not to be completely terrified, because you have to live your life, and it's not fun to just kind of live in sort of this bubble of paranoia. So just some practical ways to protect yourself and kind of exist and go forth in this world the strange new world that we live in. So there are three things to remember as we start talking about this. The first is that you are always the target. You as an individual, your information, your bank account numbers, your social security numbers, your email passwords, everything, you are a target. But don't take it personally. You're just a target. It's not you as an individual, it's all of you sort of collectively. And you're also a product. So if any of you ever join any kind of social media site or even Amazon, if you're on Amazon or any other kind of major shopping site like that, you have been commodified into being not just a customer, but also a product as well. If you think about, when you post reviews or ratings or give any kind of feedback, even your shopping habits are tracked, and all of that is sort of fed into these massive databases, and these companies start to build a profile of who you are, what your spending habits are, and what kinds of things that you like. Maybe they identify that your spending habits indicate that you have grandchildren. Maybe they will figure out the gender of your grandchildren, how many grandchildren you have. So, and this is all through your spending habits. So you get kind of put into these buckets, and you get profiled just by being online and being a part of what we think of as just online shopping, right, on Amazon. Amazon has very detailed information about you. So you are the product, and because they have that information is vulnerable. It's out there, right? So anybody with the wherewithal could go in and steal that information, and then somebody else who's not supposed to know about you knows all those things about you. So all that information is out there. So just accept it and move on. Because online privacy is a myth. That's the third thing that you should know. That if you are online, don't expect any kind of level of privacy that you might think that the level of privacy that you think that you have is nowhere near that. Nope. So if you're browsing websites and going from site to site, different sites have, they all kind of may participate in sort of what, like Google AdSense or AdWords. They all have these little bits of little tiny programs that run on each website and that tracks you from website to website to website and looks at, tracks at the products that you look at and so on and so forth. And all of that gets fed back in. So you may look at, I may be looking at presents for my nephew. He's 2 years old on one site. And then I may go to Facebook and I'll notice ads for toddler presents. And it's sort of like, I didn't know that, so it's, and all of this stuff is tracked because, and I'll get into kind of how that works, because you have little bits of information on your computer, and those sync up to little bits of information on the servers that you connect to, and then those programs put it all together and store it in giant databases. The privacy windows? Yes, and actually I'll talk about that a little bit. They do protect you, but they don't completely protect you. So let's talk about what some of the threats are. The biggest threat to you are sort of the scam, the large category of scams, online scams that there are. And when we think of scams, we often think of like people calling up on the telephone and saying, trying to scam you or scam you on the street with selling you a fake product or something like that. But as time goes on, and as the people who perpetrate these online scams get more sophisticated, they become more and more difficult to detect, and some of them become almost scary in how effective they are. And at the root of all of these scams is something called social engineering. And when I grew up in the 80s, and when we thought about hackers in the 80s, we thought about these kids that were online, just kind of like and just doing stuff, and then they would get in, right? And in fact, some of those hackers became really famous. There were people like Kevin Mitnick and others who really did kind of pioneer this sort of area of hacking, but it was sort of like this kind of garage band kind of activity where it was just a bunch of kids just trying to, push the limits, right? Because they had access to this brand new technology, and it was fascinating, and nobody was thinking about security, so it was drop dead easy to just get into any system practically. And these kids were going around and doing that. And it's only been through, the maturation of the internet and as we've gone along that hacking has been monetized, and it's been weaponized, and it's been turned into sort of ways to even destabilize governments. But back in the day, these hackers wouldn't just go and they couldn't just sit at their keyboard and hack. That wasn't actually what hacking was all about. 95% of hacking, quote unquote, was social engineering. So these kids would call up, maybe their administrator at their high school or their colleges or a hospital or something, and they would pretend to be the tech department, and say, this is so-and-so from the tech department, and I need you to reset your password. Could you tell me what your password, And so they would do those kinds of things and pretend to be somebody who they're not. And because it was early days, people would just kind of fall for it, right? And then then companies started to catch on, and they started to put in sort of rudimentary security protocols in place and do a little bit of training and so on and so forth. But social engineering itself got more and more sophisticated. And one of the most common types of social engineering is something called phishing, with a PH, so P-H-I-S-H-I-N-G. And that looks something like this. So you've probably all received an email at some point that looks something like this, where you don't know who this person is, but there's a link in there, and it sort of invites you to click on it, and maybe takes you to a site where then you would log in. And that's basically what it is. It's a deception, right? It's inviting you to visit a website, and so this website might link to a website that looks like Google Drive or your Gmail or something, and then prompt you to put in your name and password. You do that, and then they've got your username and password, because it's actually not Google. So that's just very basic deceptive phishing. But what has happened over time is that it's evolved into what people call spear phishing, which is a very targeted type of spear phishing. So you've all heard of all the data breaches that have happened over the years, right? And information getting out there, or even just you getting on a mailing list somewhere where they might have your basic information. Let's see. So they might have your name and your email address and maybe your home address, or some basic information like that. And they write programs that just automate these emails that use your information to make it seem like those emails are more legitimate. So you would say, oh, well, this email knows my name. This uses my name, and it might use my, eBay address or whatever. So it must be legitimate, and so I'm going to trust this email, and I'm going to click through to one of these links, and again, you would be taken to like a fake eBay site where it would invite you to log in and with your name and password, and once you do that, they've got access to your eBay account. But what you'll notice here is that on this one, sometimes when you use your mouse and hover over a link, you can get the address. So you can see here that this is kind of tricky. So this is the address, and it says ebay.com right here, but actually the part that we want to look at is right here, and that says uuadp.org, and that's not eBay. So they're really trying to kind of trick you in as many ways as possible. And we'll talk about how to kind of protect yourself from this, but ultimately, you really, unless you absolutely are sure 100%, and really that's almost in no cases, you should never really click on a link in an email and go to a site and log in that way. You should always type it into your address bar and then log in. And then this is for the CEOs and administrators out there. A lot of times, if a particular organization is being targeted, an attacker will do a little bit of research on that organization or that company, and they'll find out who the VPs are, who the presidents are, who the senior management is, and they'll target them specifically to try and maybe get them to download a Word document that has a virus in it or something that would then give them remote access to their system, or some other way, because oftentimes managers have elevated privileges within a system than regular people. So that would then, it takes a little bit more work, but it's a little bit more effective because it gets that really personal touch because, you know, hackers will kind of, you know, you might have a little back and forth. And then, you know, if you're pretending to be a salesperson, you say, oh, well, just look at this prospectus, you know, and the manager downloads it, clicks on it, and boom, you know, the attacker has access. And then sometimes, you know, there might not just be email. So with the advent and the rise of sort of the ability to write programs that will make phone calls, you might get something that sounds like this.
Hello.
Oh.
We have been trying to reach you. This call is officially a final notice from IRS, Internal Revenue Service. The reason of this call is to inform you that IRS is filing lawsuit against you. To get more information about this case file,
Sorry about that.
please call immediately on our department number, 501-254-7612. I repeat, 501-254-7612. Thank you.
So who wants to venture a guess what would happen if you called that number? Somebody's going to be there. Somebody's going to pick up. And they're going to pretend to be somebody from the IRS. And what are they going to want? Social Security number, right? Right off the bat, they're going to say, well, what's your Social Security number? What's your name? What's your address? What's your date of birth? Let me look you up here. And then maybe they'll say, oh, you know what? This is a mistake. Don't worry about it. And then you go about your business, you know, and then 2 weeks later, you know, you've got a freeze on your credit or something, you know. So, you know, it comes at you from all directions. And it's not just limited to those types of scams. You know, you've all heard of sort of the, you know, of hacking, which is the sort of the traditional sense of, you know, gaining remote access to servers and computers and doing sort of nefarious things to them. So why do people do this? This is a question you mentioned earlier. So let's see where I'm going to see. One of the biggest reasons why you're so at risk is that there are these sort of sprawling networked connected computers that are compromised. They have been either compromised through a virus or some kind of program that somebody ran on their computer, and they are members of what are called botnets. So, and these are very nefarious because they kind of just quietly sit there until they're needed. So, say I download a program from a program that's sort of distributed by somebody who maintains a botnet, and I run it, then my computer is then compromised, and then it phones home to a computer someplace else and says, guess what? You know, another sucker ran that program, and you now have full control over this computer. But there are millions of other computers around the world, millions and millions, who are also members of that same botnet. So imagine what the person who has command and control over that botnet can do. They could rent it out to spammers, and these things that's what they do. They rent out time on their botnet to the highest bidder. They're sort of like mercenaries, and so you know, they may work with sort of illegal spammers who want to send out, you know, Viagra spam or something, and say, you know, that's going to be, you know, for 4 hours of your time on my botnet, that's going to cost you $15,000 or something like that, and so then they can relay all kinds of mail through the botnet, and it's almost impossible to stop that because there's mail, you know, the spam mail coming from, you know, 1 million different computers across the globe, so you can't just block it, block one single computer because it's all over the place. So that's how a lot of that spam gets distributed. Yeah, no, because spammers don't play by the same rules. So you sometimes get signed up for mailing lists, and if there is the option to unsubscribe, you can often do that, but even that's tricky. So a lot of the spam that you get, you think, how did I wind up on this mailing list? And you click unsubscribe. Oftentimes what you're doing when you do that is telling the botnet, oh yeah, this is a valid email address. So that's, it's really insidious that way. So, but if you're sort of on the LL Bean catalog list and you don't want to be on the LL Bean catalog list anymore, I don't know why you wouldn't want to be, but then that's a legitimate mailing list, or if you're on the Darien library mailing list, you have the option to unsubscribe, and we will honor that, right? Because we play by the rules, and we don't need to go through botnets because there's sort of rules in place that kind of govern the legitimacy of those mailing lists. Yeah, they're not supposed to. So if you do that and you're caught, there are civil and criminal penalties for that kind of thing. So, but if you get sort of a weird looking email and it has an unsubscribe option, you might just want to delete it and ignore it. Oh, the question was if you do have if you are on a legitimate email list, will they keep your information if you click through to unsubscribe it? Is that correct?
Yeah, basically what I heard was if you
right, and that would be sort of the illegitimate. Right. The ones that are not legitimate might do that kind of thing. They're not just used by spammers. There's something called a distributed denial of service attack, and you probably heard about some of these in the news. So every website is designed to handle a certain number of visitors at a time, right? So maybe our website here in the library can handle maybe up to 300 visitors at a time, which is way more than we would ever have. But Amazon's website, for instance, is designed to handle millions and millions of users at a time. So say you had a competitor who was launching a new product, and it was really important that their website be up while they do that launch, because that's when most of their revenue is going to come in. It's going to be, it's going to coincide with all of their marketing and everything like that. And you don't want that to happen. So you get in touch with somebody who's running a botnet, and you say, you know what? These guys are launching at 11 a.m. on December 5th, and I want you to start a denial of service attack at 11:05 and make it run for 6 hours. And it's a sneaky kind of, it's dirty pool, right? But people do this. And what happens then is that the owner of the botnet says, oh, sure, I can do that. And it tells those millions and millions of computers around the world to basically go visit that site at 11:05 on December 5th. Just go visit it and then reload it. And just reload the page. Just so it's basically down. It's sort of like you're like 5 or 6 million people just visiting that site and hitting the reload button over and over again. And the servers can't handle it. So the servers just go, and they just kind of just stop responding because they can't handle it. And that's what a distributed denial of service attack is, because they are all members of these botnets. Botnets can also be, they also can do, there are also oftentimes some really scary bits of software that are loaded into these botnets. So, for example, a lot of them will give the owner of the botnet access to the camera on your computer. So they could, basically any infected computer that has a camera, they could pop it up and see what's going on in the camera. In fact, I'm not a really typically paranoid person, but I have a little piece of tape over my camera, just because when I saw Mark Zuckerberg had a piece of tape over his camera, I thought, well, I think I'm not being too paranoid. No, it doesn't. You're right.
So how do you shut off the on?
A lot of times, a lot of computers have little holes where the microphone is, and if you find it, you can put a piece of tape over it, but
Will that really cut off?
it might mute it a little bit and kind of muffle it, but yeah. Here.
So is there any way to totally cut off the camera and the audio?
If you were handy with computers, you could maybe open it up and snip the little connector for the microphone input, but then you wouldn't have microphone input. So yeah, so no, there's not an easy way to do that, unfortunately. But you can tape over your camera, and I would recommend you do that, and then take it off when you need to use it. So there's also something called proxies. So this is where we get into something called it's called the man-in-the-middle attack. And so typically, if I use my laptop and I go and visit the library website, the relationship there is my laptop and the server that the library website resides on. But sometimes you may run a little piece of software or get duped into running a little piece of software or something that updates the settings on your computer that says, you know what, don't just go right to the library website. I want you to use what's called a proxy. And so there's another computer somewhere out here on the internet, and my laptop would then connect to that computer, and that computer would then connect to the library website. And what that does is it allows that computer in the middle to basically look at all the traffic that goes back and forth. So if I log in, use my email, password, credit card number, whatever, then it captures all of that, and the person who runs that proxy can then analyze that data later and pull out the information that they need. So the question is, how do you establish a proxy? So you set up a server anywhere on the internet, and then maybe you spam out some kind of infected file document that somebody would run, and that would sort of in the background update the settings on their computer to do that. So you can go into your settings on your computer and you can set up proxies, because there are a lot of legitimate uses for proxies, and it's a way that you can. So say if I'm in a country where there's sort of a national firewall or something, or and I need to get around that, or if I want to maybe watch my Netflix while I'm out of the country, even I can set up a proxy here in the U.S. and then I push all my traffic through that. So there are legitimate uses for proxies when you know you're using them, but that gets taken advantage of oftentimes by people who set up illegitimate proxies and then get you to use them. Then there's something called Keyloggers, which is basically what it sounds like, and that is either a piece of software or a piece of hardware that will capture all of your keystrokes and then take that information and upload it to a server on a regular basis. So then the would-be attacker can then go through all that information and pick out what might be username and passwords, credit card numbers, so on and so forth. And again, these are all usually triggered by some kind of piece of malware or bad software that gets run on the computer. And there's something called session hijacking, which this is sort of when my computer talks to the library website or any website, it establishes what's called a session. And you may have heard the term cookie before. You heard the term cookie? And people said, clear your cookies or whatever. You know. A cookie is just a friendly name for a session. So when my computer says hello to the library website for the first time, the library website says, "Hello, John's computer. It's nice to meet you. I'm going to give you a special token so that I know that your computer is your computer every time you visit the website from now on." And that's a good thing, you know, because then it establishes a little bit of trust between the two, you know, the two. But that could be hijacked sometimes. So if I have a piece of software running on my computer that looks through all of my session information, looks through all my cookies, right? And then it says, oh, I'm going to take these cookies and I'm going to go tell this other site, you know, what this session information is. And then I'm going to kind of make some other changes happen on the computer so that the computer thinks that it's going to the correct site, but it's not. And then you go to that other site, and it looks like you're logged in and everything, and then they can then take that information and then log in as themselves, pretending to be you. So that it's a much more complicated way to get around things, but it does happen, and there are ways around that. There's ransomware. Most recently, you might have heard about what was called the WannaCry virus. Ransomware is it's basically it often comes in as an email attachment or something like that. Might be a Word document file or a zip file or something like that, and you run it, and all of a sudden, you know, weird things start happening on your computer, and and then a screen pops up and says, you know, if you want to have access to your computer again, it's going to cost you $300, and you have to go get something called Bitcoin, which is a cryptocurrency, and then send it to this address. And you know, and most people don't even know how to get Bitcoin, so it's not a particularly effective way to do it, but it does happen, and it's disruptive more than anything else. And then there's these other ways that really kind of hack the kind of way that the internet itself works. So, you know, when I go to darienlibrary.org and I pull up that web page, I'm actually going to an IP address that looks like 72.55.32.12. But you know, that's a terrible way to market your website, right? So you're not going to say, you know, please visit us at 72.50. You know, that's, you know, so you say, come visit us at darienlibrary.org. But there has to be some kind of lookup there. So it's sort of like looking up a name in a phone book and finding their phone number. And that's what DNS is. It stands for Domain Name System. That could be hacked, obviously. So that can be hacked so that you look up and you've given the wrong phone number, right? So say I'm calling, what if, you know, somebody could like take your phone book and you're calling your bank. You want to call your bank and somebody takes your phone book and switches the number, and you call it up, and there's somebody on the other end pretending to be the bank, and you know, so it's the same kind of concept. And host files are just an easy way for attackers to facilitate that, because they overwrite any kind of lookup that you do on the internet. And then there's something called Lulz, which is basically that's sort of the term given to attackers who just do this stuff because they're digital vandals. And you know, vandalism has been around forever, and it's just evolved to take advantage of the new playground that is the internet. And so a lot of times you'll have, you know, and these are where the kids, you know, a lot of these are just kids or just, you know, troubled adults who are just defacing websites and doing all kinds of stuff like that, just to cause havoc and to be able to point to it and say, ha ha ha, look what happened there. So where do these threats come from, and what specifically do they attack? So we'll start with what's called 0 day. So anytime, we hear about vulnerabilities in systems all the time, right? And this is why we run updates on our computer, because we get security updates, because no software is perfect. Software is created by human beings, and and it's highly, highly complex stuff that usually that teams of people work on, and then it's put together, and it's not infallible. Software is inherently insecure, and it always will be. But there's sort of a race starts the minute that a vulnerability is discovered. So say a computer scientist is looking at something, or somebody reports something that is a security vulnerability. So right then and there, the clock starts ticking, right? Because the security professionals have to start getting that information out to other security professionals to say, these are the things you got to do to protect yourself. But it's not just security professionals who are listening; it's the bad guys who are listening as well. And so they say, oh, new security threat. This is how we can take advantage of it. And so this race condition starts to take place where publishers and writers of software are trying to push these updates out while the bad guys are trying to take advantage of that vulnerability while it's still in the wild. And that's sort of what the 0 day concept is. And it's also why you should always run your updates, because if you don't do it, you're kind of left behind. And you're left behind with insecure software. And insecure software is probably, second to sort of being scammed into running malware of some kind, and being duped into kind of getting viruses on your computer or whatever. Insecure software is the next most common reason why systems get compromised, because it's a pain to update your system. And sometimes you go to do your Windows update or your Mac update, and it says, oh, it's going to be 42 minutes. You're like, oh, I just wanted to order a pizza, or I just wanted to check my email real quick. I'm not going to do that right now. I'll do that later. But then you check your email, you order your pizza, and then you forget about that because it's, you've already clicked no, I'll do it later, and then that reminder goes away, and then you just go about your business, and your computer remains insecure. So that's again what attackers expect. That's sort of the expected behavior. A lot of software is now starting to give you options like, just do it automatically for me tonight. Schedule it for 3 in the morning, that kind of thing. But there are some problems with that too. So, you got to leave your computer on for that to happen, because it's not going to run the update if you shut your computer down. A lot of times, you can schedule that, but then, you got to reboot your computer to do it, and the updates will automatically do it for you. But sometimes that reboot process gets hung up on something, and you'll go the next morning, you'll be like, oh, Windows wants to reboot, but you need to close this other program for it to do that. So, you got to make sure that you close out all of your other programs, and so it's problematic. It's not perfect. When the bad guys learn about these vulnerabilities, they will oftentimes automate the process of taking advantage of them. So they'll create programs that will allow you to target a specific range of computers and look for these vulnerabilities, and if they exist, take advantage of them and gain access to the system. And it's just automated. It's sort of this automated process of hacking. So and then those tools get uploaded to the internet, and 12-year-old kids can download these things without really having a whole lot of additional knowledge about what they're actually doing, but they can get access to systems that way. Well, so the question is, and it's a really good question, how do I know that the window that pops up asking me to update is legitimate? Well, usually there's sort of you can kind of tell the difference between a window that pops up that's part of a browser or a website and a window that pops up that's part of your operating system, because they both look a little bit different. You can look at sort of the bezel around the window and see, those kinds of things. But really, if you're really concerned about that, the best way to do it is to just say, no, I won't update right now, but then go to your update program, Windows Update on your computer and do it manually, and initiate that yourself. So then you know that you've done it. And
I have to initiate it, I have to know what it is.
Right. So on Windows, it's Windows Update, and it's usually right there on your menu somewhere.
But if it's standing by it, that's enough to be installed.
Right. So then you run Windows Update, and it will scan and see if there are any available updates, and then it will give you a list of updates that need to happen, and then you can run them. On a Mac, it's very similar. Nowadays, you go to the App Store and check for updates, and it will give you a list of updates that you need to do. They could, theoretically. I mean, any system can be compromised at any time, but if you practice good habits from the beginning, then you have a reasonable level of confidence that your system is okay. There's no such thing as 100% confidence.
Right. But that's not a question of good habit.
Yeah, I mean, again, it could be a website that does that. There are websites that will run a piece of software like a keylogger, and it will pop up a tiny little window, and it will pop up underneath your taskbar, so you don't even see that window. So when you go to other sites, and even if you close out your browser, you haven't actually closed it out because this tiny little window is still sitting under your. So, these are all really, these are all things that can happen, and you just kind of have to, look for them, or just. And we'll talk about getting into good habits and how to kind of get around some of these things. A lot of your computers have firewalls built in now, or your router at home, if you have wireless at home, has a firewall built in. And basically what a firewall does is there's a whole lot of different types of network traffic that goes in and out of your home, right? So if you're browsing the web, you're using a specific port number. And if it's unencrypted, you're using port number 80. If you're using encrypted web traffic, it's port number 443. Maybe you're using Netflix. Netflix has its own proprietary port, probably port number 5,800 and something. And it's basically sort of like lanes on a highway that are designated for certain types of traffic. And what a firewall does is it opens and closes ports that you need or don't need. And firewalls have gotten a little bit better about sort of knowing what you're going to make available, in and out of your home. But oftentimes, sometimes, these firewalls are not configured correctly and leave these ports open, which basically means that traffic can come right in through your firewall through these open ports. So sort of having a little bit of a basic, looking at your firewall settings and saying, I want this kind of traffic to come in, this kind of traffic not to come in. It's a good exercise to do and to kind of get to know how to do that. Unencrypted network traffic. So you've all seen the little, when you go to a website, you see sometimes you'll see a little green padlock up in the address bar or something like that. That means that you have an encrypted web session, and that's a good thing. That's what you want. What you don't want is to have an unencrypted web session. A lot of sites are now forcing all traffic to be encrypted. So we do that on our library website. So even if you do HTTP darienlibrary.org, it will redirect you to HTTPS. And if you can see that HTTPS, that means it's encrypted. And that's really important, especially if you're on, say, a public Wi-Fi network like we have here in the building. You know, you don't want to go to a website and log in with your username and password if it's not encrypted, because I can run a little program on my laptop here that will sort of listen to all the wireless traffic that's going on, and if it's unencrypted, then I can actually see your username and password, being transferred back and forth. And then sometimes there are Trojan Horses, and these are just kind of what they sound like. These are pieces of software that masquerade as something else, and you download them and you run them, and then they take over your computer. And this is how a lot of these things get in. And maybe they sort of hijack on something else. Maybe it's sort of like a solitaire game. You're like, oh, I'll install this game of solitaire. And you install it, and it's a legitimate solitaire game, right? But that wasn't really the purpose of that program. The real purpose of that program was to install a bit of software that was always running in the background that either joins you to a botnet or something else. And then viruses. Viruses are a little bit different in that they can hop from file to file, and they spread. That's why they're called viruses. They spread like a virus. And in sort of the networked age, they can now hop fairly easily from computer to computer, especially if you're sharing files that way. So having a good virus checker, like Norton Antivirus or something like that, is important. But just as important is keeping those virus definitions up to date. So every day, new viruses come out, and you need to keep those virus definitions up to date. And a lot of times that will be automated, but sometimes they're not, or sometimes you don't have your computer on for long enough for them to really be downloaded in the background and installed. A lot of these virus checkers will do, sort of scan through your computer in the background and check for viruses. But again, you might want, those oftentimes will slow down your computer, so your computer runs really sluggish while these virus checks are going on, because it's doing a lot of work. It's looking at every single file on your computer, and so a lot of people disable that feature. And they say, oh, I don't want that because that's making my computer run slow. So you don't want to disable it, but maybe you want to schedule that to run in the middle of the night. So now you got two things you want scheduled in the middle of the night. One is your updates, and one is your virus updates and your scanning. So, what time should which one happen? So should one happen at 2 a.m. and another one happen at 4 a.m.? So these are the kinds of things that you need to ask yourself. And it's a pain because then you're sort of like, you're setting up, these schedules for your computer to do. And you got to make sure that each one has enough time to run through what it needs to do. So, maybe your virus scan takes an hour and a half. So if you start that at 2, make sure you don't run your updates until 4 a.m. because that means, it could cut that short. So there's little things like that. There's sort of administrative things you have to think about. And then finally, brute force, which used to be more in vogue, but now there are some easy tools that have been put in force. So brute force basically means, like, if my password is password 1, right, or password 3. Let's say my password is password 3, and along comes a brute force attacker that tries passwords in sequence. So it might try password 1, well, that doesn't work. Password 2, well, that doesn't work. Password 3, boom, I have access. So that's what that is. But a lot of sites now, after a certain number of failed logins, you'll be completely locked out. And so that's not a great way to do it. But what does happen is if an attacker gains access to a database of passwords that are stored in an encrypted hash, they'll download that entire database and start running these brute force programs against the encrypted passwords in the database. And then they can sort of decrypt all these passwords in that way. Yeah. So this is usually now used when somebody, say somebody gets access to sort of the database, a database dump of user accounts by some means. Then what will be inside that database dump is sort of this long, sort of encrypted string that is the encrypted version of the real password. And because they have all that data on there, they've downloaded it, they have all the time in the world, and they can make as many attempts as they want on each one of those records. So then they run through that, and a lot of people use really insecure passwords. Some people do use password as their password, and so they try these things all through, and then they have another data set of logins and passwords that they can then use on that site or on other sites and try to see, well, because a lot of people reuse passwords from one site to another, which is another big, huge no-no. Because if my password on Gmail gets compromised, what if I have that same password on PayPal and the attackers say, well, I'm going to try PayPal because, with these credentials, because I have them, and that's what they do. They try different sites with the same credentials, and they get access to them, and then they have access to, what, their financials or their email or whatever. So, so that's how this is kind of typically used now. It's not used in the traditional sense of trying to log into a site over and over. It's once they get access to that information. Which is basically, that's why there's data theft. And data theft is used for a lot of different reasons. It's used for corporate espionage. It's used for blackmail. It's used for, it's used for a whole host of different reasons. And maybe they just want to sell it. So, and then finally, physical devices. So there are physical devices that sometimes people might plug into a public computer or something like that, or a little USB dongle that will, circumvent the security on your computer that will then install programs. So there are a lot of things that people do that way. One sort of really sneaky thing that people do are to use a keyboard logger that kind of sits between the USB connector on a keyboard and the computer, and then it logs all the keystrokes. So, we talked about habits. So poor habits are sort of the biggest cause for all of this. So how do we build good habits? So make sure that whenever you're visiting a website, you use HTTPS so that all of your connections are encrypted. And so always look for that little green lock. And if it only says HTTP and not HTTPS in that URL, sometimes sites will support HTTPS. They're just not forcing you to it. So you go up and then insert a little S between the HTTP and the colon, and then try and reload the site. And sometimes that will work. Don't ever log into a site or use a username and password unless it's encrypted. So you've checked for a valid security certificate, and that's sort of that green. If you have that green HTTP or that lock, then you know it's a valid certificate. Password managers. We could spend a whole hour talking about password managers, and in fact I have before, but I would highly recommend looking into something like LastPass, which, so which one of those passwords would be better? Right, the first one. And so you should have a password like that first one on every single site that you log into, and it should be different for each site. But how are you going to ever remember that? Right? You're never going to remember that. So use a password like LastPass, and it will manage all of your passwords for you. It will even generate these crazy-looking passwords and help you update them on your accounts. So that if you go to Amazon, then you log in with a super strong password that no amount of brute force is going to crack, at least until quantum computing comes around. But that's a whole different story. But you know, those are much more secure passwords. So
How do you install LastPass?
so go to lastpass.com. Again, that's sort of beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today. But you know, download it, and there's a browser extension that you can install for different browsers. I use Chrome, so I use the Chrome extension. There's Firefox. There's also Internet Explorer. And it's sort of like it usurps the built-in password management that a lot of browsers use. You know how browsers will often say, "Do you want me to save your password?" This replaces that. So, yeah. No, it'll allow you to install a piece of software. You'll have to create an account on LastPass. So that's the thing about a password manager. You remember one password and you make it a good one, but you remember it. You know, type it up, print it out, put it in a safe or whatever, you know, in your files. But you have to remember that. And then you use that one password to have access to all of your other passwords. But only you know that password, and not even LastPass can gain access to your passwords. Only you can through the piece of software that they give you.